Hello and welcome to Crosstalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. Donald Trump is one of the most unorthodox presidential nominees in American electoral history. He is unpolished and very brash, but some of his foreign policy ideas are intriguing, even commonsensical. This terrifies and enrages the establishment. To Crosstalk Donald Trump's foreign policy views, I'm joined by my guest, Stephen Yates in Washington. He's the CEO of DC International Advisory and chairman of the Idaho Republican Party. In Los Angeles, we have Nomi Prince. She's the author of All the President's Bankers, The Hidden Alliances That Drive American Power. And in Orlando, we cross to Alex Newman. He is an international journalist for various conservative publications. All right, Crosstalk rules in effect. That means you can jump in anytime you want, and I very much appreciate it. On the last edition of this program, we covered Hillary Clinton's worldview. I think we called it the Hillary Doctrine. So, Nomi, if I can go to you first in Los Angeles, because you got up earliest for this program, and I very much appreciate it. How would you describe, in a nutshell, what Donald Trump's foreign policy views are? Because people bandy around the term realist. How would you describe his foreign policy?
Well, I think you have to break it up regionally, his foreign policy, because he has a policy that's very provocative, obviously, with respect to Mexico, with respect to China. And then he has a policy that appears to be more embracing with respect to, for example, Russia. So his policies with respect to immigration and the foreign initiatives that he is talking about in terms of building a wall with Mexico, in terms of, keeping jobs out of China and back within the United States. That's one element that crosses economic and foreign policy. And then with respect to Russia, with respect to his relationship or his want to be relationship with Vladimir Putin, he has a more conciliatory tone. And he has for the duration of his campaigning. And that's actually been very consistent. On the other hand, he has no details in terms of what he would do with respect to that conciliatory tone. So there's a lot of color and not so much black and white with respect to Russia relative to China and Mexico, where it is pretty much black and white on a foreign policy perspective.
Stephen, people have used the term realist. I mean, at the same time, we saw him give a major address just hours ago that he's still a military hawk. I mean, he wants to spend a lot of money on the military. He's kind of shifted his position in this campaign here. But I think it's fair to say that his foreign policy is nuanced because he is questioning some of the pillars that we've, in the popular narrative of foreign policy, are the establishment's bread and butter. For example, how NATO functions and who should pay for it. I would have to say to our audience here that those ideas are not new. They're not new ideas originating from Donald Trump. People have been saying this for 25 years, but the media makes it sound like he's the first person that's ever said these things. Go ahead, Stephen.
Well, I think that the media is just rediscovering a lot of these things, as you say. I think there are two broad things that actually do define and animate the way he's thinking about and articulating a foreign policy, and he's put it in several speeches. There's more there than a lot of other candidates actually put out by way of detail. And one of them is, to the extent any of these guys listen to international relations professors, and I don't think many of them do, he does fit into the realist school in the sense that he's focusing on relations between states without regard to the nature of the state. That's a little wonky, but there's a lot of liberals and neoconservatives who focus a great deal on the nature of states in terms of whether they want regime change or whether they'll sanction or have a foreign policy because of the nature of a state. The other thing is Donald Trump is first and foremost a businessman, and a lot of the way he thinks about these things is transactional in a negotiating position. And so what he's talking about now is setting a table for a future discussion. And so whether it's Russia saying he thinks it would be better to have a positive relationship with Russia is not the same thing as saying whatever Russia wants, he's okay with. He's ready to talk and to negotiate. Same with China, and really with his visit to Mexico, there's a lot of things there too. So I think there's a lot of his personal experience as a businessman negotiator, but really he is pushing the Republican Party and the broader discourse far back in the direction of realism, where it's moved away from in recent decades.
It's very interesting. Alex, if I go to you in Orlando, recently Trump has said peace through strength and a focus on diplomacy, not destruction. What's wrong with that? I mean, as I said in my introduction, it's very commonsensical, some of these things that he's saying, but he's being called some kind of traitor to American exceptionalism and et cetera, et cetera. I don't see that. I see there are things that, you know, he says on domestic politics that I kind of scratch my head, but when it looks at foreign policy, there's some nuance there, and it should be followed up on, because the last 8 years of American foreign policy has been nothing less than a disaster. Go ahead, Alex.
There's no question that the last 8 years, and even before that, of U.S. foreign policy has been an absolute disaster. And I think the key to understanding Trump's foreign policy as he articulates it is America first. And so this is a big break from the past with the globalism and the multilateral institutions, and everything has to be for the benefit of the UN and the NATO and you know, what the globalists think. And he's taking a fresh approach, and I think it appeals to a lot of Americans. Why shouldn't the U.S. government, which is supposed to represent us, which we pay for, why shouldn't it treat the American people as the first and foremost priority? I mean, that's so logical. And I think when you look at it through that lens, it makes sense of all the different things. It creates a coherent framework. So, you know, whether we're dealing with communist China manipulating their currency and, you know, operating with mercantilist policies, Trump says that's enough of that. You know, we're not going to let you take all our jobs, take all our technology, take all our companies, and then reinvest here and buy up all of our assets here. That doesn't make sense. And so Trump says, no, we're going to do an America first policy. So at least as he articulates it, I think it's a very, very good and a very refreshing stance on international relations and foreign policy. And I think it drives the media nuts, and it drives you know, the establishment, the globalist nuts, but I think the American people like it, and I think the polls show that. You know,
Nomi, it's very interesting what we just heard from Alex, because in a way Donald Trump is bringing democracy back into foreign policy. I mean, you have Hillary Clinton saying that, you know, no one should question certain tenets of American foreign policy. Well, why shouldn't we? We should all question it, and particularly if it doesn't work, we should question it. And again, not to give Mr. Trump a free pass, but some of the things he has to say are reasonable. Go ahead, Nomi, in Los Angeles.
You know, when I was listening to you, Alex, and to your point, Peter, taking China for a second and taking what he has said about China, and there is an element of every country wanting to do what is best for their country, and he has struck a nerve with a faction of the American population that relates to that, as had Bernie Sanders when he was running, in terms of, you know, what is better for our country, how do we prosper, how do we keep our jobs. The problem that I have with respect to China and how that folds back into the relationship of the U.S. to Russia and China to Russia, which is a growing alliance on that side as well, and which has to be taken into consideration, and which isn't being taken into consideration by Donald Trump or by Hillary Clinton, is that the idea of, to move to China for a second, the manipulation of the currency, all of that, it isn't actually true from the standpoint of the objective evaluation of that currency. For example, you know, China has had economic issues. There have been a situation where the People's Bank of China has tried to move their currency up and down. It has also tried to respond to the idea of a free market reform, to the idea of what the IMF has wanted by it being included in the SDR of the IMF. And it has been a subject of what has happened when it has allowed its currency to float by more on the open market. And that has devalued it. It has not necessarily been that they have manipulated their currency. So I think it's just inauthentic with respect to foreign policy to say that there's a manipulation going on, and it doesn't mean that China's not trying to protect itself as well. Of course it is. But a lot of it, it just gets painted in broad terms. I think that's a negative on both sides. Of course, you know, Hillary Clinton's policy is quite combative as well, and that's a whole separate issue that I know has been discussed here before on her side. So when you look at how that relates into Russia, I think that it would behoove either side and the dialogue.
Okay, well, go ahead.
I'd like to jump in real quick about the currency issue.
Go ahead, Alex. Go ahead.
The idea that China does. The idea that the communist Chinese government doesn't manipulate its currency, I think, is absurd. The Federal Reserve manipulates the U.S. dollar, and I'm opposed to that as well. The problem is that China, the communist Chinese government, does it very successfully. I mean, their economic policies have worked very well for the Communist Chinese Party. Maybe not so much for the Communist Chinese people, but for the party, no question about it. And I think Trump has really struck a nerve on that because it's so obvious to everybody. I mean, every central bank in the world manipulates its currency, whether they raise interest rates, lower interest rates, print more money, print less money. All of this is currency manipulation. There's no question that every central bank is doing this, including the one in Beijing. But the question is, how do we, as the American people, and our elected government, which is supposed to represent us, how do we deal with that? Do we allow them to do that? Do we allow them to undermine our economy? Or do we take a stand and say no? And I think Trump has, Trump doesn't have any record in government, so we have to take him at his word on what he says. But if he addresses this issue, I think it's one of the key issues that needs to be addressed. And I used Communist China as an example. I think it applies to Mexico, to the European Union, to NATO.
I think it's
all
a really,
of these things
it's a really good example. Let me go to Stephen here before we go to the break here. I think what Nomi and Alex have brought up, I'd like to broaden it out a little bit because I think it's really important, is that all countries have their national interests. And just because a country has a different national interest, they shouldn't be made into an enemy. And this is the narrative that is coming out of Washington, is that everybody's an enemy if you don't agree. And this is really troublesome, and it's very dangerous. Negotiate, sit down and talk, and stop all the bluster. Go ahead, Stephen, a minute before we go to the break. Go ahead.
Well, I think it's troubling and also simplistic. I also think that when it comes to China and other areas, we've had policies that have been in place basically since Henry Kissinger was in the White House. And so a lot of these orthodoxies do need to be challenged. And the economic relations with China is much broader than just the currency. There's a lot of rebalancing and recalibrating there. We've given them a pass that we've given to no other country, whether it's Russia or otherwise. And so I think there's a lot of recalibrating, and that's, I think, one of the more positive things of what Donald Trump has brought to the table. Bernie Sanders did it on the Democrat side.
Okay, and Nomi, real quick here. I mean, one of the things that's really disturbing to me is that you had all of these neocons abandon the Republican Party and move over to Hillary. I find that troublesome. 20 seconds before we go to the break. Go ahead.
Well, she has had a very hawkish perspective on both Russia and China. I mean, that's been something that's been a part of her foreign policy as Secretary of State and as beforehand. And going back to the idea of manipulating currency, of creating debt, of trying to both preserve your own nationality with respect to your country and try to actually make both countries stronger, whether that's China and the U.S. working together in trade, whether that's the Russia and the U.S. working together in trade, that's an issue as well. She's been combative.
Okay. Nomi, I have to jump in here. Really, I'm sorry, I have to jump in. I have to go to a short break. After that short break, we'll continue our discussion on Trump's foreign policy agenda. Stay with our team. Welcome back to Crosstalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. To remind you, we're discussing what might become the Trump Doctrine. Okay, Alex, let me go back to you in Orlando. You know, I love my job for a variety of reasons. Most importantly, I get to say what I really think. And second of all, I get to travel sometimes. And you know what? I travel to countries and I see brand new infrastructure. I see societies that used to be very, very poor, have very modern airports and modern cities and transportation. And I see what happens in the United States. And the reason why I'm asking this or saying this right now is that we know the American people are tired of these foreign wars. These are stupid wars. These are wars that are not necessary. They're terribly, terribly expensive, and the costs never end when you have vets coming back home and having to deal with them, or not dealing with them, if you know what I mean. And so, again, you know, when Trump says these foreign wars are not good for the American people and the economy, he's called an isolationist. I mean, again, the mainstream has just turned everything upside down. Go ahead, Alex, in Orlando.
Perfect comments, Peter. I think the establishment has gone mad, and they think that, people in the real world agree with this craziness, the idea that we need to run up $20 trillion in debt so we can bomb and rebuild countries. And I think Trump has just taken a very common sense position here. We should have peace and prosperity if possible, but we should have a very powerful military in case that doesn't work out. Peace through strength, he said. He mentioned peace and prosperity, America first. As for what he says, I think he is right on the money. So if and when he's elected president, I hope he'll follow through with that, because that's really what the American people need now. How much more of this destruction and death all around the world? I mean, look at what they did in the Middle East during the Obama administration. We have a genocide of Christians now. We have ISIS. We have Syria destroyed. We have Libya destroyed. We have Iraq destroyed. And certainly Bush contributed to the Iraq fiasco. We have the migrant crisis caused by all of this destruction. So, it's time for something different. The American people do not want this anymore. We're $20 trillion in debt. It's not going to work. It's not going to continue continue. And you know, for Hillary and for her supporters, mostly in the press, actually, to pretend like this is reasonable or normal, you know, you just have to wonder, what planet are these people living on?
You know, Stephen, I completely agree with Alex. I mean, I'm far away from the United States, but when Hillary Clinton says, job number one, the first thing I'm going to do in the Oval Office is destroy Syria. I mean, already it's destroyed, needless war there. I mean, I have to wonder if she's connecting with the average people, because most people are aghast by that kind of thing. Why we have to go around the world and change regimes, and we need a regime change in the United States. But, you know, more broadly here, you know, and I'm going to kind of date myself here, but I've watched in my lifetime a number of people, men, go into the White House that didn't have a lot of foreign policy experience, and Barack Obama is one of them, even though I think his foreign policy is an abject failure. Ronald Reagan didn't have very much foreign policy experience. Jimmy Carter didn't. A lot of them didn't, and you know, they rose to the occasion. I don't understand why Donald Trump is not fit to rule. I mean, Hillary Clinton did rule, and she is unfit. Go ahead.
Well, I think that they are not, that Hillary's people and some of the establishment of Washington are definitely misreading the country. I mean, as I can say, traveling around a state that's very far from Washington, the people kind of get it, and they are tired of overextension. You talk to military families, and they have members of their family that have deployed multiple times and paid a huge price, even if they haven't come back wounded. They've been gone a lot, messed up their jobs, and completely changed their lives. It's been expensive, it's been disruptive, and they're sick of it. And it's completely consistent with longer American tradition to believe that you try to help your allies take more of what they can do in their own part of the world. You can be supportive, but keep America strong so that no one provokes us. Having the strong military supposedly should help you keep the peace, because people wouldn't dare challenge you. So having a strong leader that has the resolve to retaliate if we're attacked, but not out there trying to take and hold territory or topple governments, is actually more consistent with longer American tradition. We should still be trying to influence the world, but the military shouldn't be our first or only weapon or tool of influence in that.
No, I mean, you know, one of the things that Trump has been criticized is about NATO. But again, I'm sorry, I have to keep using the same word, common sense. I mean, if you want to be in a military alliance and you expect the major power to be there, why don't you cough up a little bit more dough to pay your way? I mean, 2% of your GDP, just 2%. And if you don't want to pay that, then why should you expect the benefits of security? Go ahead.
Yeah, well, the elements of NATO that have been around for a long time, and the establishment has supported that. It has supported the idea of NATO and the idea of paying for NATO on both the Republican side and the Democratic side. And it's not necessarily been just to keep the peace. It has been to basically promote the idea of America influencing other countries. It's not simply to get in and help them. It has also been to get in and be quite destructive and be quite authoritarian. And so the standpoint of having, you know, looking at it from a financial perspective, if you reduce that necessity and that idea of expansion to be authoritarian and to be sort of supremacist as opposed to perhaps helping or helping less, those two things would also balance the amount of money that needs to be spent. I think all of the money in NATO needs to be reduced. I mean, NATO has been for a long time, you know, something that hasn't necessarily been effective in terms of what it's doing. And so I think on the one hand, there's a logical aspect to, if the U.S. is a part of it, to having other countries pay more. But I think in general, the entire construct needs to be reduced, because the idea of being strong by getting involved to help is not necessarily what has happened. We are strong because in a lot of places we are very aggressive. And so I think both of those things need to be cut back. That is something that Donald Trump has not been discussing, and it's not at the pulse of what America wants or doesn't want with respect to how its money is spent from the population perspective. But it's a half of the equation that he has been missing. And so has the establishment for again, both parties.
Yeah, let's stick with the establishment. Alex here. Again, when I look at when Trump talks about foreign policy, I get the impression sometimes he just has very fresh eyes. Maybe he's not as well informed as he should be at times on the details and the facts. I mean, that's what I do for a living, is look at details and facts. But, you know, questioning NATO. Well, the Cold War ended 25 years ago. We don't need it. If we have to have it, why shouldn't it be? It should be tailored to fight terrorism. That is a threat to the Western world. And that's not happening. As a matter of fact, you know, Europe's house is burning down, and they look for enemies that don't exist. They can't control their own borders, and they want to beef it up. And again, you know, from where I live, you know, and pointing all their missiles at Russia. Russia didn't cause the immigration problem. It hasn't caused the economic problems in the European Union. It hasn't caused any of those problems whatsoever, but all the money goes in one direction.
Yeah, I think it's an excellent point, and I really do hope that if and when Trump is elected, he'll take a fresh look at all of these international multilateral institutions, NATO, the United Nations, NAFTA, all of these things. They all need to be revisited. You know, look at what Obama did in Libya. He used a UN resolution as an excuse to go in with NATO and bomb the country to smithereens. Now, Donald Trump has been very clear, even on ISIS, that we need a declaration of war from Congress. Now, this is so obvious. This is plain as day, right smack in the Constitution. How can we only have one presidential candidate talking about the need for a declaration of war from Congress? I mean, it's so basic. You do not let the UN Security Council deploy American military forces into some foreign country to overthrow a government. It's total craziness. And so I think Trump has said, you know, we need to revisit this idea, and we need to have Congress declare war when it's necessary to fight a war. And it's not always necessary to fight a war. So, you know, again, these ideas are really resonating with the American people. They're so obvious. I mean, this has been the American tradition for 200 years. It's only been over the last 50 years where the president and the United Nations and NATO just deploy our forces willy-nilly around the world to blow things up. And that's craziness. It needs to end.
You know, Stephen, one of the things that I think enrages the establishment and its very pliant mainstream media is that it doesn't like the idea of foreign policy being democratized. It doesn't like the idea that foreign policy can be debated. That's their realm, and they're very jealous about it. You have these neocons that have gone over to Clinton. They want to keep it all a small circle, and they don't want the American people to debate this. But it's the American people's money, it's their blood, and I'll tell you, all three of you, it's their reputation in the world as well. You know, the reputation of the United States has been very much damaged since the end of the Cold War because of this galloping around the world, destroying countries and societies. And it really comes back. It's called blowback, and that can last a long, long time. Go ahead, Stephen.
Well, I think there is blowback in our political system against these people. I've always thought of it as the guild, whether it's the Foreign Service or others, but I've lived with this. I've served alongside people who were card-carrying members of this guild who basically believed that foreign policy was for them to decide, and if you came into these jobs and didn't go to the right university or associate with the right people or read the right publications, then you somehow were less qualified or less smart or less with it in order to try to engage and influence our top leaders. And they've basically had their hand at the till for Republican and Democrat administrations going back several cycles. I mean, remember, Hillary Clinton's spokesperson at the State Department was Victoria Nuland, who was one of my fellow staffers in the office of the Vice President during the Bush administration.
Goodness.
And
really?
So, I mean, you've got people who have literally crossed this divide because they're members of this guild. And I think that Donald Trump and a lot of other people have really tapped into this idea that you started with, which is the need to democratize this. Foreign policy of the United States is not legitimate or durable if it isn't based somewhat in a dialogue with the American people.
Let me ask you one real quick question before we end the program. Do you think because they want this coveted area of foreign policy, the reason why they're relying upon these McCarthy-like tactics against Trump?
Well, I think, yeah, this is definitely a classic power play. These people want to control what the United States does in the world. It enriches them, and it also makes them feel happy to be in a place of influence and have an exclusive job. And so whether it's the mahogany office or the red carpet when they go abroad, that's what they lust after, but they really don't represent the American people, and I'm happy there's some blowback.
Okay, on that note, gentlemen and lady, many thanks to my guests in Washington, Los Angeles, and Orlando. And thanks to our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time. And remember, Crosstalk rules.
I love you.